Being broadcast. Can you hear me in the back okay? Okay, my topic is socialized medicine, and my claim is that socialism in general, and socialized medicine in particular, are unjustified on two basic grounds. One is the ground of morality, and the other is the ground of efficiency. What's with the morality business? Well, it seems to me that the essence of morality is voluntary interaction between consenting adults. In sex, a lot of people will go along with that, but I would like to expand that to include all interaction. Now, there's this young man here who's got that camera, and he's focusing on me. And I have taken a desire to have that camera, and I really like that camera, and the only two ways I can go about getting it. One is I can pull a gun on him and say, give it in the air, I'll shoot you. Or I can rely on the fact that I'm very eloquent, and I'll get all of you guys to vote with me against him that I should have his camera, and then we'll all gang up on him if he doesn't give it to me, which is democracy or tyranny of the majority. Both of those ways are uncivilized. They're barbaric. The only proper way to get that camera out of him is say, I'll give you $100, I'll give you $200, I'll be your best friend forever, or something. And if he says no, well then I just can't get the camera. Well, socialized medicine is run on a barbaric scheme where people are forced to pay taxes and then other money goes in other various ways, so it's immoral. Well, what about efficiency? I think socialism is not very efficient for lots of basic economic reasons. Mises had this idea that under socialism, when you don't have free prices, when the government owns all the means of production, there's no prices, you're in a calculational chaos kind of a situation. Hayek, a Nobel Prize winner, said that without the information that free market prices give us, we don't know how to plan or how to have a rational economy. In socialized medicine, if you don't have prices for things, that is market prices, if government owns everything and runs everything, well, you never know, should you hire 3 more nurses or a half an MRI machine or 1/10 a doctor or what? You're in a calculational chaos situation. We have several almost controlled experiments, North and South Korea, East and West Germany, through some accident of war, became different countries. And yet they were the same people, the same culture, the same language, the same intelligence. And one, they're practically starving, and the other, they're doing fine. And the one where they're starving is socialism. So socialism is not very efficient either. And yet the principle seems to be socialism doesn't work here, socialism doesn't work there, so let's take 1/6 of our economy and socialize it. It's just very silly. Okay, with that introduction, let me get into some of the specifics of socialized medicine. My claim is that the reason we have such dire straits is because it's so bloody expensive. If medicine cost as much as pizza, there'd be no crisis. There's no pizza crisis, and we don't have pizza socialism, we don't have pizza insurance or anything like that. Why then, speaking of pizza, I see it out there, why then is it so bloody expensive? And the reason it is very, very expensive is because the AMA, American Medical Association, has contorted the economy in such a way with the contrivance of government, such that there are great restrictions on entry. John, where are you? Where is my man, John? I was supposed to take a break at this point. Well, give me 2 more minutes while they unload the pizza, and then I'll call a halt and we'll all dig into the pizza. So why is it that there are so few doctors? The reason that there are so few doctors is the AMA has long practiced this principle of restricting entry. There are many, many applicants for medical schools and very few acceptances. There are many fewer medical schools than there would be in a free enterprise situation where anyone could set up a medical school subject to no licensing but just certification, and I'll get into that in a second. Not only would there be more medical schools, but each medical school could accept more students. Now, this wouldn't solve the crisis in the next minute because it takes 5 to 8 years to come up with a doctor who's entry medical school student. But this would go a very long way in the direction of lowering prices, because I just happen to have a blackboard here, I see. I even have chalk. Because what's happening is here is the quantity of labor, and here is the wage rate, and here is the supply of labor and the demand for labor. And what the AMA has done has made supply of labor prime, which is much to the left and to the left of the supply curve that would ordinarily have occurred. And thus doctors, instead of getting this wage, wage 1, they get wage 2, where wage 2 is much higher. At this point, I'll take a break of a bad thing. Now they're busy doing type 2 errors. Before you can get any drug licensed or approved by them, you have to spend inordinate millions of dollars, and it takes years, so people are suffering from lack of drugs. They've even gone so far as with regard to cancer patients who are in the last throes of their illness, and they want to try an experimental drug, and the FDA won't allow it because their criteria is, unless it's proven beneficial, that they don't approve of it. Now, I don't mind the FDA making mistakes. That's why they put erasers on the back of pencils. To err is to be human. We're always going to be making mistakes. What really rankles me as an economist, and what really rankles me about the licensing government monopoly situation, is that they're still in business. I mean, if they were a private company, they would long be gone as a certification agency. Anyone would say, well, you FDA certified it, give it a Bronx cheer or something like that. I come from New Orleans, where FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers between them contrived to kill about 1,500 people. Again, the tragedy was not so much that 1,500 people were killed, although that's a horrible thing, but the tragedy was that they're still in business. The post office is still in business. The Motor Vehicle Bureau is still in business. All these things are still in business. Whereas when you make a mistake in the private enterprise system, there's this automatic weeding out thing, which is why the pizza is pretty good and why wristwatches are okay and ties. There's no tie crisis. Because if there were a bad tie manufacturer or a bad pizza place or a bad wristwatch place, they would not have as many customers, and without enough customers, they would eventually go broke. So you have this weeding out process. Okay. There was this case in Canada where a horse had gallstones. And the woman who owned the horse took the horse to the doctor or the veterinarian, and within a day or so, the horse had its operation, and then 3 days later, it was well on its way to recovery. The owner of the horse also had gallstones, but in Canada, you can't get service for 18 months for this sort of thing. So she had to go into the hospital back and forth and give her painkillers, and finally, after 18 months, ruining her life pretty much, they did this. Now, had she done this for the horse, they would have put her in jail for animal cruelty. Happily, they don't have socialized medicine for animals there, because if they did, that would be cruel. But I guess it's okay to be cruel to humans. There's no such thing as human cruelty in such a situation. Here is a list of Canadian waiting lines. The Canada average, my statistics come from the Fraser Institute here from Canada. Orthopedics, 25-hour wait. Plastic surgery, 20 weeks. Ophthalmology, 22 weeks. Gynecology, 13 weeks. Urology, 12 weeks. General surgery, 9 weeks. Cardiovascular, 18 weeks. These are average waiting lists in Canada. And what they do, if they've got any money, is they come down to the U.S. to take advantage of free, not free, but paid service. And that's what rich Americans do. We go up to Canada because then they will serve us with no waiting list because we're paying on the barrelhead. And I think that this is a much better system. Imagine if doctors, instead of making the kinds of money that they now make, made a lot less, consistent with wage 1 instead of wage 2 on my diagram. Well, then we'd be in a lot better situation. What I did in order to get a feel for what these numbers mean in reality is I tried to ask, well, suppose medical schools doubled or tripled in size and doubled or tripled in the number of people that they could invite to be students, and the supply curve shifted to the right and the wages were much lower. What would the wages be like? And in order to get a potency variable for this, I asked, well, what are the kinds of people who would likely go to medical school if it was opened up and we didn't have this restricted entry? And my answer was, well, PhDs in biology. Why PhDs in biology? Well, I think they got the smarts to become a doctor. And also, unlike you lawyers, you might like figurative blood on the floor, but you might not be as comfortable with literal blood because, you know, that's not your thing. Whereas people who can dissect a frog or a horse or whatever can dissect people and treat people. And the statistics I've got is that doctors earn 3.5 times as much as PhD biologists. So if you use that as a proxy, this number is 3.5 times that. Doctors, instead of making, oh, I don't know, 600,000, might be making 175 or something like that. And we'd have doctors up to our armpits. We'd be paying them a lot less, as we should be in a free enterprise system without restrictions on entry. And a lot of the, not all, but a lot of the medical crisis would be a thing of the past. In other words, the reason we have the crisis is because of government in the first place. And the solution to it is to get the governments off our backs, out of our wallets, out of our bedrooms, out of wherever it is that they're in. But the AMA will have an alternative theory. And maybe my commentator will push this theory. It's erroneous, which is why I'm now accused. I'm just kidding. What they'll say is, no, it's not a restriction on entry in order to raise salaries, although the Flexner report in 1910, 1911 had actual quotes from doctors saying, you know, we got to keep these new entrants out of here because they're lowering salaries. It was very blatant then. Nowadays, they're more likely to say, oh, well, it's quality. We have to have Cadillac doctors. We can't let every Tom, Dick, and Harry become a doctor because then we'll have incompetency and we want good quality. Well, suppose we applied that to cars. And we said the only cars allowed on the street would be Cadillacs or better. Maseratis, okay, but no, I don't know, no Hondas or Volkswagens. Would we, as a consuming public of cars, be better off? Well, the average car would be much better, but most of us would be walking because we can't afford that, or there'd be a long waiting list, or you'd have to share cars or things like that. They have citizenship as a criteria for entry. I have a cousin who, the first year he applied to medical school, applied 20 or 30 of them, cousin Mike. And he didn't get into any. The second year he applied to every medical school in the country, and he didn't get into any. The third year he got into, I think it was Italy or Belgium or somewhere like that, and he got his medical degree. And then the fun began because he came back to this country and had to start suing everybody and his uncle to get to be able to practice because they didn't want to let him in, and he finally got in. There were two other very interesting episodes. One was in Vienna in the 1930s. A lot of doctors, Jewish doctors in Vienna, were among the best doctors in the world. And from 30 to 35, the emigration out of Vienna, out of Austria into this country was not too much, but from 35 to 39, it was very, very big. And yet the number of new doctors on the medical rolls in those 2 5-year periods was about the same, indicating that the mass emigration of doctors, Jewish doctors from Vienna, didn't make much of an impression on the rolls. Why? Because they made him sign only citizens could apply. Well, that's just restricted entry. Why do you have to be a citizen to be a doctor? The other one, the biggie, was they made him take the exam in English. And these guys couldn't speak English that well. They might say, well, this is evidence for the AMA case because it shows you need good quality. Because if you come into a doctor and you say, well, I need my elbow taken care of, and he starts sniffing around your knee, well, then you're not going to get good medical service. But there are 3 arguments against that. First of all, there are unconscious patients. And if the guy is just lying there, there's no question of language. Any doctor can take care of him, whatever language the doctor speaks. The second one is German-speaking patients. At least the German-speaking doctor could take care of German-speaking patients with no question of quality. And the third one is, this is why God invented translators. Just for this purpose. Now, it might cost more to have a translator, but surely that should be up to the parties concerned. It shouldn't be up to the AMA or the government authorities to say, well, since you don't speak the same language or you can't take the exam in English, we're not going to allow you to practice at all. Why are the doctors able to get away with this? Well, they're the experts. And there is this thing called the concentration of people as producers and consumers. As consumers, we consume thousands of things. As producers, you guys are going to be producing just one thing, legal services. Doctors produce doctor services. I produce economic services. So we're much more concentrated as producers than as consumers. We're very disparate. It's hard for us to cooperate. So when the toothbrush manufacturer comes to Washington for a subsidy, and it'll cost each of us a dime, and they'll make millions out of it, they're more likely to succeed, because to just write a letter to stop this will cost us more than a dime. So that's why you have this fascist regulation, welfare, corporate welfare sort of a thing that is endemic, and it's not just Obama, it was Bush, it was pretty much every modern president. Okay, so much for the supply side. Economists think of supply side or demand side. That was the supply side. If we had more supply of doctors, a lot of the problem would go. But there's also a demand side. If you price medical services very, very low, and again, here we have a supply and demand, and here is the supply and demand, and now this is the quantity of medical services, the price of medical services. Well, if you charge a very, very low price of zero, you're going to have a vast outstripping of demand, which when demand is greater than supply, that's just the shortage, or that's why we have waiting lists. It's that simple. Also, people tend to use things based upon the price of it. Right now, milk costs a lot of money. Suppose we said, well, you know, poor babies need more milk. Let's have price controls on milk. Let's keep the price very low. Well, there'd be a shortage of milk. I'm told that milk baths are better for you than water baths. Well, people started taking milk baths. Kids who now shoot each other with water guns would start shooting each other with milk guns. Namely, if the price is low, it's sort of, for medical services, a hypochondriac's dream. Oh, you know, my armpit hurts, you know, I'll go into the doctor. No one loves me, no one will talk to me, I'm an idiot, I'm a moron. At least the doctor will talk to me, and I can go visit him every day. So you have overuse of service, and then when it's important that there be service, well, the service isn't available. Let's talk a little bit about medical malpractice, which is another crisis. Depending upon the specialty, you can pay as a doctor for medical malpractice anywhere from $50,000 to $300,000. That might be a bit high, but it's very, very high, and it varies based on the discipline that you're in. And not only does that add to the cost of medical service, but the doctor now has to practice medicine with half an ear or half an eye on his lawyer. And his lawyer is going to say, somebody comes in with an elbow problem, well, you better take a full-scale MRI and a CAT scan and everything else you can think of, because if this guy sues you, you'll be in trouble. So you have additional unneeded medical service because doctors aren't practicing medicine, they're practicing a thing called medicine-law. Now, I realize this is an audience that might not be receptive to that, because a lot of you guys are going to be making money off of this stuff, but I'm asking you to take a public-spirited view of this and look at this as a social scientist and not as a lawyer who might be having cases like this. And it's just silly. If you look at the practice of medicine from that point of view, what you want is doctors doing their best to cure patients and not worrying about suing. Now, I imagine under a free enterprise system, there'd be all sorts of different kinds of contracts. For example, I'm a doctor and you come to me and I say, I'll give you two prices. One, a very, very high price, and here you can sue me if I make a mistake. On the other hand, I'll give you a much lower price, and you have to sign a thing that says that no matter what happens, even if I leave my stethoscope in your stomach, you can't sue me. Okay, if I do, I'll open you up again and take it out. I'm a big, big man, but you can't sue me. Now, the courts will not allow that. They'll say it's not in the public interest or something like that, but a libertarian court would allow that, or a court that believed in contract would allow that. It's just these modern hippie socialist commie courts that won't allow that. But if you had reasonable courts, they would certainly allow that. And then different people would have different contracts, and a big different problem would evaporate. I'm now calling another time out because now there are sodas there. So let's take better, because he's supposedly libertarian, and have this idea of putting a cap on medical malpractice. Well, I'm interested in justice. but why would there be a cap? I mean, whatever the cap that you put on is sort of arbitrary. It's very much like an intellectual property. What should be the length of time for a patent? Well, any number is arbitrary, and I'm, as a libertarian, against patents and copyrights. Therefore, that problem doesn't arise for me, but it arises for the people who advocate that sort of a thing. I mean, if you make it 27 years or 50 years, well, why not a year more or a year less? What we're after is justice, not just the ersatz ways of solving problems on a pragmatic case-by-case basis. So caps, I don't think, cut it in terms of justice, and they're not justified. Why not have free contract? Is that such a difficult thing for an ostensible libertarian to favor? Well, I guess it is. Okay, I've got two other things that I want to talk about. One is body parts, and the other is drugs. Let's do body parts first. Another problem, another health problem that the government is screwing up royally is the problem that they won't allow markets in used body parts. Let me take a survey. How many of you good people have already signed on, when you get your license renewed, a thing that says that if you die, the government can take your body parts and put them in other people? Raise your hands. Wow, that's a very high number. I would say a third. So I'm going to draw a supply curve, as is my one. And the supply curve is like this. Let's say here is the price, and at a zero price, we've got roughly 1/3 of this audience that signed on. Now, I'm going to take a little survey, and I want you to not cheat. Don't anticipate me, because I'm going to keep raising the price. And I now offer you $100. And I ask those of you who have not yet raised your hands, tell me if you would sign this. It doesn't mean we're going to come get your body parts. It just means that if you die in a motor vehicle accident or some other way like that, we can now take your body parts and transmit them to other people. How many additional people, in addition to the third, would sign a thing if I gave you $100 to sign it? Not a one. Okay, so we have another point right here at $100, namely the same 1/3 are still signing. Now I'm going to offer you $500, and no holdouts, please. Don't think that I'm going to raise it again, which I will. But I'm now going to give you $500 for something that your classmates signed for zero. Any takers? 2 or 3 more. Okay, so we're now, let's say, at 40%. And this is $500. Okay, I can see I'm going to have to be bigger numbers with this crew. It's a hard sell here. How about 5,000? Okay, so we're now up to, I don't know, 60, 70% at 5,000. We're working on a supply curve. How about 50,000? That's a lot of money. How many have not yet raised their hands? Okay, you guys, I just can't deal with you. Okay, but here we have 50,000, and this is the supply curve. And we have a demand curve for these body parts. Right now, the price is 0. And at a price of 0, just for kidneys alone, there are 80,000 people who are in need of kidney transplants, and there are only 20,000 transplants per year, so you have 60,000 people who are either dying or living on kidney dialysis machines, which is 4 or 5 or 6 hours a day of not very comfortable existence. Pretty grim situation. Yes?
Does that number account for those who are not acceptable for donation?
Does that number count people who are not acceptable for donation? Well, you see, that's what they do now. What they do, in order to pick this 20,000 here, what they'll ask is, do you smoke or do you drink? And if you do, they won't give you a kidney.
I'm thinking more simple, or even more of black letter. Those who are just, they're going to die anyway, regardless.
Right. Those people would not get it. The people that would get it are the people who are not old. You would be a better recipient than I would because I'm older than you. People who smoke or drink or what have you would be less likely to get it. The reason is because very few people are willing to donate. Many, many more people would be willing to donate. Now, there are 2 ways to donate, cadaveric, and non. Namely, you can do it as a live person because you only need 1 and you got 2. There was this guy, Alonzo Mourning, a basketball player, who just got one from his cousin or his brother. Or you can get it from dead bodies. And the problem for the economists is that there are people going into the grave with perfectly good innards, kishkas as we call them. And then there are other people who are going into the grave because of the lack of them, and never the twain shall meet. This is sort of like an economic horror story, because economics is the art of cooperation with each other, and here we're not cooperating with each other. People have perfectly good kidneys that are being wasted, and other people are dying for those kidneys, literally dying for them, they can't get them, because the goddamn government has got this fetish about non-commerce. They hate commerce. In other words, it's legitimate to give it to someone, but if you charge for it, it's no good. They do the same thing with sex. It's okay to have sex with someone, but if you charge them for it, you know, it's prostitution, it's evil. From the libertarian point of view, either it's evil per se or it's not, and whether you charge for it or not, it should be irrelevant. So, what we would do is have a market in, I've only got 5 minutes, so I'm going to have a question and answer period later. What we would do is have a market for this stuff. Now, there are some people say, well, if we legalize it, then we'll unleash the monster, the whirlwind, people will start grabbing each other's kidneys. Nonsense. Right now, I'm assuming that the incentives to grab people's kidneys illicitly, against their will, is proportional to the price of a kidney. Right now, what is the black market price of a kidney? The black market price of a kidney is way up here, price 2, whereas the free market price would be price 1. See, what you do, in order to get what the price is, you ask, what is the supply? Well, the supply is only 20,000 now. And I'm stipulating that the price would be, the quantity is only 20,000 now, and I'm assuming that the quantity would be 80,000. Namely, everyone, whatever age, whether they smoke or not, would be able to get one. So paradoxically, we would be much safer from this sort of a thing than we are now. The third thing I want to talk about is legalization of drugs. See, I've already talked about thalidomide and cancer-causing drugs, namely legal drugs. Now what I want to talk about is heroin, cocaine, marijuana, things like that. What's the situation with regard to things like that? The situation is, here is the quantity, here is the price of these illicit drugs, and here is the demand curve for these drugs, and this is the supply curve. Why is the supply so limited? Because it's illegal. You want to supply this stuff? You have to hire people with guns, which are expensive. Suppose it was legalized. Well, if it was legalized, the supply would be much lower. No one would have to kill anyone to get any of it. When we did the same thing for alcohol in the early period, you had things like bathtub gin. The equivalent of that would be impure drugs from which people die. One of my heroes, Lenny Bruce, died from that. In the earlier period, you had young Italian men shooting each other. Now you have young black men shooting each other. Every life is precious. These people who are responsible for that law are a bunch of murderers. I don't think I'm being too extreme in saying that when you pass a law that eventuates in other people's deaths, you're a murderer. So what we ought to do is legalize this stuff. If we legalized it, it would just be a medical problem, like alcohol now is a medical problem. It's only a medical problem. It's not a problem over which people shoot each other. No one shoots anyone over Shenley's or Pabst beer or anything like that. Also, a non-medical problem, 2/3 of our inmates in jails are due to drug crimes. So we have all sorts of expenses on needlessly warehousing people in jails that we wouldn't have to do if we had a free enterprise system. We could take that money and put it in healthcare or other good things. Why put people in jail for victimless crimes? Now, it's okay to be paternalist with children. Children deserve it. You know, if they're 3 years old and they don't brush their teeth, what the heck? But we're talking adults now, consenting adults who are going to jail for putting crap in their bodies. Now, look, you have to distinguish between the case for legalizing and support of. I do not support the use of heroin, marijuana, or any of that stuff. I think it's foolish to use it. Wouldn't want my kids to do it. But if my kids did it, I wouldn't want them to go to jail for it. Right? Whereas, right now, they go to jail for that. Our jails are full because of that. Let me summarize. What I'm trying to say is that the case for free enterprise is across the board in general. It's based on morality and efficaciousness. It certainly applies to the healthcare field. What they're now doing with Obamacare and Bush care and Medicare and this kind of care and the other kind of care is a move away from free enterprise, and the solution to the problem is free enterprise, not socialism or fascism. Thanks for your attention.
There'll be a 25.
AMA is, can you hear me in the back? I don't think the AMA is government, but the AMA is a quasi-government institution, because if you try to start a medical school, they put you in jail, and it's at behest of the AMA. It's sort of like saying the Fed is not a government enterprise. The Fed is a government enterprise. The president appoints the head of the Fed and all the other people. Yes, I agree. It is immoral that you die with no health care available. And I think the reason people are dying with no health care is because we just have too few doctors because of this quasi-governmental AMA. Health care is a right. Well, I think that there are so-called positive rights, the right to food, clothing, shelter, medical care, but they're not really rights. They're just a demand for wealth. If it's really a right, then it should be timeless. Like, for example, it is a right not to be raped and not to be murdered, and it was as true now as it was true 100,000 years ago when we were in the caves. It's still immoral to be murdered or raped, and it'll always be immoral to be murdered or raped. But it can't be always immoral to be not have modern health care, because modern health care is just a part of the modern period. Now, if people are really worried about health care, well, what about food? I mean, if we didn't have food, we would die in, I don't know, a day or two. Most of us, young people, you're not going to die if you don't have health care. If we took all food away, we wouldn't have much of a chance to live. If we took all medical care away and we went back a century or two, civilization would continue. Old people or sick people would die, but food is more important. So why don't we have socialized food? Or socialized clothing. I mean, the winter is coming, and if you don't have clothing, you're going to die. So based on that argument, we should socialize the entire economy, which I think is tried in the Soviet Union. It didn't work out too well. I think it's quite right that if you throw enough resources at it, even if you have I erased that one, but getting back to the hypochondriac, if you make a zero price and you put a lot of money, as they perhaps do in Japan, well, then you can cure that, but then you're taking money away from other things that are more important. Again, you have no sense of planning, no ability to plan. She says she wants to, I don't really want to defend the U.S. system. And the U.S. system is certainly not a free enterprise system. The U.S. system is patently not a free enterprise system, so I'm not going to defend it. But one of the reasons that our health care isn't as good as, say, in, I don't know, Japan or Sweden or somewhere, is we have a very heterodox population. Certain aspects of our population are incomparable. If you compare Caucasian people in the U.S. with Caucasian people in Sweden, of which it's virtually all the same, then our health care starts looking a lot different. The reason that the U.S. looks badly compared in these international comparisons is certain ethnic groups are much worse than other ethnic groups. I certainly agree, administrative costs, who favors them, but there are administrative costs everywhere. And in the market, what happens is you have a weeding out of places that are inefficient in this or in any other way, whereas in government, you don't. You have administrative costs. I mean, it's easy to say, well, let's get rid of fat in government, but it's a lot harder to do because we have entrenched interests, we have unions and other people. She mentions our free enterprise system. I think that's a horrible thing to say. I'm insulted. We do not have a free enterprise system now. We have a system that's got all sorts of socialist and fascist and regulatory elements, and to say that we have a free enterprise system is, I think, is very erroneous. With regard to hypochondriacs, yes, half the population is going to want a mammogram, I think, because we don't need them. But other people will, when in doubt, have more services than not. And when you have look, if it's so great to have a zero price, why don't we have a zero price for food? Why don't we have a zero price for clothing? Why don't we not allow the market system to work for us? The reason that we have the magic of the marketplace, the reason we have the miracle of modern society is because we have prices, and prices have a role to play. And if you say, well, I'm not worried about zero prices and people overusing stuff, well, why not generalize that? I mean, if we had no prices for anything, we wouldn't have a modern economy, and we'd be back to barbarism. So if we extrapolate what she's saying about healthcare to other industries, and economics is economics on whatever industry, well, then we can see that there are problems here.
I just wanted to ask Professor Block whether you think if we tremendously increase the number of doctors, which is another thing, by the way, another area where we agree, do you think that the price of health care will come down to the point where the kind of people I represent, say, who get $700 a month, will be able to afford?
Well, you know, when cars first came out, they were the playthings of the rich. Only the rich could have a Duesenberg or whatever it was, and then Henry Ford made it possible for the middle class to have cars. And nowadays, you know, I remember watching the Olympics, and what they would do is they would do interviews of Soviet gold medal winners, and they invariably showed them in a little car and in an apartment. I was wondering, why do they do this? And then I realized that the only people in the Soviet Union who can afford a car or an apartment is you win a gold medal in the Olympics, and then they'll give it to you. Whereas here, you can work in McDonald's, and you're not going to be able to live on Fifth Avenue and 12th Street, but you know, you can have a little car. It's the same thing with air conditioning. The poor nowadays have air conditioning, they have color TVs. Sure, if we had triple the number of doctors, a lot of this problem would all of it go away? No, there's no perfection on this side of the Garden of Eden. But if we had many, 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 many more doctors, the prices would come down. It would be like computers. When computers first came out, a computer was the size of this room and it cost, I don't know, $250,000. When I was a graduate student in Columbia, they had these computers that were gigantic. Nowadays, you get this little computer in a what do you call it?
Laptop.
Laptop or something. Not even a laptop, just in a cell
iPhone.
phone.
BlackBerry.
And can poor people afford those things? Yeah.
Well, actually not.
Okay.
There are some poor people who have color televisions and cars. There are some poor people who don't have color televisions and don't have cars, and they don't have anything, and they don't even have a place to plug in their color television because they don't have homes. So I think we have to recognize that there are going to be very poor people who aren't going to be able to afford it, even if it's, you know, and in Medicaid, when they made a $10 co-payment, there were people who stopped going to the doctor because they couldn't pay the $10. So.
There are very, very, very poor people, and if the government hadn't taken over charity to the degree that they have, these people too would be helped. But you can't make a public policy for 1/10 of the population, and indeed, a lot of the plight of these poor people comes about from other government programs. For example, welfare. Take the black community and welfare. Slavery was not able to undermine the black family. After, you know, they say if you throw a frog into the water, boiling water, it'll jump out. But if you put it into cold water and heat it up, its metabolism is such that it'll stay there and be burned or boiled. Well, slavery was like boiling water for the black family. It jumped into slavery and it jumped right out. And in the census of 1900, 1910, 1920, the black family was almost as intact as the white family. Then came Johnson's welfare program in the 1965-70 period, and all of a sudden there's no black family. Well, when you don't have a family, an intact family, when the illegitimacy rate is some 75% of the population, of course you're going to get people that fall through the cracks because they don't have a community anymore. And this is a horrible sort of a thing, but it's due to another government intervention.
We open it up for Q&A, and I just want to remind everyone there's a class that comes in at 1:20, and the professor's going to come in a couple minutes before that, so just be mindful of the time, but until then, have at it.
The man in the back.
Just defining the label poor, I mean, compared to some people, I would be wealthy, and compared to others, I would be considered poor. So I don't think that's a really empirical statement. I'm just wondering your opinion about that.
Well, you're right. It's all it's relative. But with respect to medical care, the question is do you have enough? Is there a way that you can get it? There are people. My point was that even if prices came down quite a lot, that there'll be some people, however you define it, who don't have enough money in their pocket to get it. And so I'm skeptical that that just something that will lower the cost a lot would solve our problem of there being a lot of people who didn't have enough money to get it, and as a result would be sick. And I wanted to make a practical point, by the way, with respect to, it's not just a moral thing. We don't want to be out on the street and see people who are dying. It's also bad for us. Even if you don't care about the people dying, it's bad. It's the father of socialized medicine was Otto von Bismarck, you know, who was not a socialist, but who had a national health program because he wanted the Germans to be healthy. He wanted there to be healthy factory workers and healthy soldiers, and he saw this was a way of getting it. When people are sick, and it includes people who have diseases that we can get, and so it's just not a good thing in a country where there are people who are sick and not getting treated.
Well, I certainly agree it's not a good thing when there are people who are sick and not getting treated. We have different views as to why this is. I would just say, yes, there are poor people who can't afford a color TV, but there is no color TV crisis right now. There is no computer crisis. There is no crisis where free enterprise is involved. There are plenty of crises where the government is heavily involved. This young man.
Well, I guess one thing I want to mention is if you're saying, you know, you're really concerned about 18,000 people a year dying for lack of health insurance. I mean, there's 300 million people in this country, or whatever the number is today. So if that's really the concern, and then you're also saying that it's a political decision how much money we want to put into this system, I mean, really shouldn't the concern be the allocation of this huge quantity of money? I mean, paying whatever it would cost to save 18,000 people would be a drop in the bucket of what's already being spent. So it seems to me that what should be looked at is the political decisions which are already being made, and then we should then think, well, if the political decisions today are being made are not in favor of the poor people, and perhaps the system is being all corrupt today, why would we expect that to ever change? Why would this system all of a sudden start supporting the rights of poor people any more than it does? It would probably continue to be a middle-class entitlement.
Well, I think we're not running on a blank slate, and so you can look at the experience of other countries that have determined to provide universal health care as a right to everybody who lives there. And you can look at what they spend and what the outcomes are. And you can decide, I like what we have better than what they have in Canada, or you can decide, well, they have some things in Canada that are better. Or you can look at France or England, which have very different systems, and look, they pay less and they have better outcomes.
Right, but
If
why are we talking about?
Let me just get a comment on this. If health insurance were really a right, it would be a human right, not a U.S. right. And if it's a human right, every human on the planet should be available, this should be made available for every human being, not just immigrants or illegal immigrants or legal immigrants. Everyone in South America, everyone in France, everyone in Africa should be available, which indicates that it's not really a human right, it's rather a benefit. Yes, this man in the brown.
Yeah, I want to say there are a lot of people out there who are outright opposed to Western modern medicine. There are people who believe in spiritual healing, people who believe in faith healing, people who do things like Reiki. Under universal health care, should I be forced to pay for Reiki and vortex healing, and should people who believe in that be forced to pay for oncology? And like, where do you get this freedom of choice if everybody's forced to pay for this type of medicine that it just so happens that the people in charge think is the way people should be treated, when the truth is there's a lot of discussion and debate about it among the citizens who are going to be forced to pay into it?
Yeah, that's an excellent and fascinating question, and one that's occupying a lot of attention in the countries in the world that have these universal coverages, and it's even a question here. I now can get Rolfing paid for in my insurance company, though I can't get an acupuncture. So when there's political pressure or market pressure, stuff gets covered.
I don't think it's a question. I think it's a vicious attack on your position. And the point is that
I thought it was very courteous.
It was courteous. It had a point, and I think the point is, look, not everybody likes pizza. If the government collected money from everyone and then gave back pizza, well, some people say, I don't like pizza and it's unfair to me. Well, if government collects money for X, whatever X is, healthcare, anything, what about people that don't like it? What about faith healers? What about, should we give money to the Christian Scientists who have other ways of doing it? There isn't, in other words, this is part of the immorality of forcing people to pay for things against their will. The benefit of pizza is anyone who wants it buys it, and if you don't want it, you don't buy it.
On the other hand, if it's cheaper overall, then why should I care that some of my dollars, which are less than I'm now paying, are being used to pay for your alternative therapy?
It's not going to be cheaper. It's going to be much more expensive when the government does it, because when the government does it, if they make a mistake, and governments make mistakes, we must admit that, they don't go out of business automatically. That's why government always costs more than private enterprise. Yes, guy in the gray.
I have a question. I just like this one.
Could you speak a little louder?
Okay, so firstly, I know the free market will guarantee, all the free market guarantees, if I understand my economics correctly, is that there's the least amount of wasted resources, right? There's no guarantee whatsoever on distribution, right? Free market does not guarantee any distribution model at all. So, in any free market, there's no way you're going to guarantee that everyone's going to have health care. That's number one. Number two, even if you want to get, even if it was possible to do, just anecdotally, right, or empirically, lots of people, the only way it would be possible, like you said, if we had a lot more doctors, right, and there were many more doctors, the price of the doctors would go down, many more people would have access, right? But then the main reason we don't do that is because we have these tests, and it's hard for people to go into medical school and everything like that, right? And the reason why we have that is because we want to ensure certain quality. We have a government-regulated quality, right? And so, like you said before, okay, we could have, they do something similar with cars, right? You said, well, you can get your crappy little car if you want to. Yes, but there's also regulation on cars. You can't just build a car that's going to fall to pieces on the road. Same thing with baby toys. You can't just buy baby toys that's going to kill a baby if they start putting it in their mouth. Or same thing with, like, food. You can't just have unregulated food. There's regulations on everything. And why is it that there's regulations on all of these different products? It's because it goes right back to economics. There's, in order to have a free market principles requires perfect information, right? That's one of the requirements of any free enterprise. People have to know what they're getting. Right? No? Okay, you can argue from wrong. Anyways, okay, so if for getting medical services, it's much more difficult to understand what you're getting because it's much more complicated. People don't know exactly what they're buying. And so regulation is one way of basically informing people or guaranteeing that you're getting some certain standard.
There is a guarantee of distribution in the free market system, and that is the people who produce the stuff get the stuff. The free market is much more egalitarian than socialism. Because in the free market, when you get rich by enriching others. Bill Gates has got a lot of money, but every time he sold a computer for $500, he sold it to someone who valued that computer more than $500, otherwise he wouldn't have bought it. So the way he gets rich is by enriching other people. Lyndon Baines Johnson went into public service with nothing. He was a very poor man. He came out very wealthy. Every dollar he got was by pushing people down. So the free market system is more egalitarian, not less. Also, we're not against regulations. Look, why is it that the McDonald's restrooms are clean? Because they have regulations. They go around to the McDonald's place, and if they're not clean, they take their franchise away. There's private regulation. Why is it that Disneyland is very safe and Central Park isn't as safe? Because if a rape or a murder occurs in Disneyland, there are horrible losses on the part of private people. If a rape occurs in Central Park, does Bloomberg lose any money? And certainly you don't need any perfect information. Look, yes, doctors are difficult, but so are engineers. People don't have information about medical services, but they don't have information about physics, about astronomy, about chemistry. Does that mean we should nationalize all those things as well? That's silly.
There are some information on doctors that, it's very hard to get information on that you can understand on insurance policies. That's, you don't know until you actually have a disease whether this particular thing is going to be covered. That's, I think, a significant problem with the market, and one where some government regulation has had a beneficial role in at least clarifying that's what plans either have to have or not have.
The insurance industry is one of the most highly regulated by government industries. If it was regulated by the market, it would be a lot simpler. This is another case of thinking that we now have as free enterprise. It's not so. Yes, sir.
Speaking about the rapes and murders, things like that, if you're taking an approach where society does have a benefit for everybody, including libertarians, you have things like police officers and military personnel that are socially paid for through taxes to defend what you have. And there is issues of people abusing healthcare industries, but there is issues where people get cancer they didn't decide on. And where would you find a separation between somebody coming up to you with a gun and somebody coming up to you with a death sentence of cancer and saying one was a choice of yours like pizza or milk or a car, and one of them is a gun to your head? I'm definitely libertarian on everything except for healthcare. If you believe in a nationalistic system that's going to protect its citizens, this is the way that I can't make the separation between healthcare and a military or police force.
I can answer that, but I need at least 3 or 4 minutes. We're almost out of time, but I'll do it very, very quickly.
Let's talk afterwards.
Well, I think it's a very important question. What you're really talking about is not healthcare. What you're really talking about is pollution, creating cancer on the part of other people. Now, in the 1830s, there was a whole bunch of environmental cases. We would call them environmental cases now. They were called nuisance cases then. And typically what would happen is some factory would be polluting some little old lady's laundry, and she'd go to court, and they would pretty much support her and say that the factory had to stop the pollution, which we now know causes cancer. And this had beneficial effects because the court now had to use more expensive anthracite coal rather than cheaper, dirty, burning sulfur coal. But in the progressive period, in the 1870s and the 1880s, the court stopped upholding property rights against trespassing smoke particles and told the little old lady, yes, they're violating your property rights, you're stinking, selfish, sniveling private property rights. There's something more important than private property rights, and that's the public good. And what does the public good consist of? Well, we wanted to outdo England in being an imperialist country, so we're going to let them do carte blanche. The only thing they had was minimum smokestack regulations. And now we have all sorts of pollution. So this too, so you're making the same mistake as she's making. You're thinking that the problem that we have is due to free enterprise. No. The problem we have is due to a prior violation of free enterprise and property rights, namely allowing people to pollute carte blanche. And there are no incentives to not pollute, because if you don't pollute, your competitors will engage in that stuff, and you lose out. So if the government would only protect property rights, that problem would go away.
Property rights would save people from any sort of
Cancer.
Not any sort, but if
I'm talking about any sort of health ailment that you did not choose,
it wouldn't.
regardless of what started.
Look, perfection is denied us on this side of the Garden of Eden. All I'm saying is that what the government did is it took a wrong turn, 180-degree wrong turn, and it allowed pollution all over the place, and that's not the market's fault. If there was a free enterprise court, hint, hint, you guys, one that upheld private property rights, then we would have had much less of this, not zero. But you never get zero. Young man in the back.
But I believe that the questioner was not literally saying that somebody walks up to somebody else and says, you've got cancer, and bestows it on them the way a polluter might be doing, but was just saying, you know, someone delivers bad news to you that you've got cancer.
There are a lot of health ailments you don't have choices on, just like if you need protection police-wise, you don't have a choice. If someone's trying to rape you, you don't have a choice if you have a life-threatening illness. It is something that is put on you as a victim of either design or of somebody's action. It has nothing to do with you, and it's protecting you as a civilian of your own country.
Well, look, black people have sickle cell anemia. Jews have Tay-Sachs disease. These are biological. Nobody gives them to you. It's just part of our biology. Yes, you're right.
If somebody was more prone to being murdered then because of his race, you wouldn't try to protect them as a citizen, regardless of race.
Look, the reason we have so many murders is because the government police can't protect themselves or us out of a paper bag. If we had private police that competed with each other for serving people, we'd have a much better shot at it. One last question.
How about the-
Yes, young lady.
I liked both of your presentations. I heard
That's really big
an
open-minded.
overarching theme of efficiency subject to morality, and then rejoining morality subject to efficiency. And I thought, and especially following this man's question, that possibly part of the problem with our healthcare system might be phrased as a rejection of Bismarck's idea of efficiency supporting morality. That although efficiency might correspond to morality in a practical sense, we don't feel comfortable legislating it because of its ramifications on individuals. And I thought I would like to hear if you both have like a final word on maybe how morality doesn't quite belong in the answers to problems.
Well, that wouldn't be my final word. My final word is really that we're not writing on a blank slate, and that in trying to figure out what to do next, we have a lot of examples in the United States. We have a number of different systems, some that are quite free enterprise, some that are really socialistic, some that are mixed bag. You can look at Europe, you can look at countries where there's no insurance and there's no government health care, and you see what happens there. I think that there's just a lot to learn by looking at what's happening in other countries. And I think if one looks at that, you might come out closer to my position than to Professor Bloch's, though perhaps the opposite would be true.
I guess my final word is free enterprise is the most moral system and the most economically efficacious system. Socialism and fascism. Socialism is government ownership of property. Fascism is super regulation. Fascism and you don't need goose-stepping for fascism. We've got it right in this country with no swastikas. It's just an economic system. It doesn't work. It impoverishes people. It breaks up families, as in the case of welfare. It puts people in jail needlessly, as in the case of drugs. It ruins our healthcare system because it doesn't allow enough doctors to come to practice.
Thank you very much.